Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. It's been a while. We are, as counter-programming month comes to an end, we're going to ease back into the warp and woof of like political stuff, but not really just swim out to the deep end of the punditry quite yet. And one of the better people for this sort of transitional gray area between evergreen philosophical navel gazing and actual punditry type political stuff is my friend Tim Carney, colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute, and a writer, longtime writer for the Washington Examiner. Wrote a really wonderful book called The Big Ripoff, which I still go back to from time to time. And most recently, forgive me for forgetting the title of your right there, Family Unfriendly. And also one of the first books, one of the first writers to sort of really nail the relationship of social and civic capital and populism in the during the first Trump administration, which was
Alienated American.
I'm sorry. I had to do CNN at 6 a.m. this morning. And so I'm basically on a vision quest. And so yesterday, I was emailing with Tim. And I was like, so is there anything you particularly want to talk about tomorrow? And he said, well, have you seen my whorehouse coverage? And I immediately assumed, because Tim has been covering sort of K Street corruption forever, and it's sort of one of his ballywigs, I just assumed that he was talking metaphorically about what was going on K Street, or maybe what the crypto bros are up to, or maybe this Intel thing. I mean, there's a lot of whorishness in Washington these days. And no, Tim meant it literally. Falls Church has a whorehouse in it, to paraphrase a musical. So I figure we just got to get that out of the way, because that's going to be really hard to segue into later. So why don't you just tell me about your hard-hitting whorehouse coverage?
So I live in Falls Church, Virginia, in the part of Fairfax County that's called Falls Church, separate from the city of Falls Church. But I have this friend who, like most of my friends, he has 7 to 9 children, and his wife, wanting some relief from her back pain and foot pain, and having walked by a spa called Rose Spa in her neighborhood, thought, oh, I will look into Rose Spa to see if I could, get my sciatica treated or whatever. They were uninterested in female customers, she soon learned. And then a little bit of digging by her husband made him realize that the thing on offer there was not back rubs, but sex. Mm-hmm. And so then one day, my wife noticed the police lights in front. I was a passenger in the car. She pulled over. I walked out. The cops walked away. They didn't want to talk to me. But the neighbors, I said, hi, I'm here to write about, and I pointed, and they said, the brothel? And this is Falls Church. So everybody uses a polite term, which is brothel. But so right behind Wild Tacos, which spells itself with a Z and is run by Greek people. And so they call their gyros Greek tacos. Right behind there.
What a country.
Is Rose Spa, which is also, reflecting the diversity. Chinese women, Chinese owner. And if you Google the phone number, you should have your safe search turned on. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
You will get advertisements for what this place really offers. And the cops say they're not going to do anything about it. They say their hands are tied. Now, there's multiple ways to take it.
I thought that costed extra. But anyway, I'm sorry,
exactly. just a little bit. But they say they're not going to do anything about it. And part of it is that we have a prosecutor in Fairfax County named Steve Descano, who, as far as I can tell, wants to legalize prostitution. And so this is his way of doing it. So anyway, I'm on multiple neighborhood listservs about this. And sometimes you probably have had this where you talk to somebody, you don't know their last name, but you know the context. Mm-hmm. And so there was very briefly a woman, I won't give her actual first name, but let's say it's Sarah, whose name on my phone was Sarah Brothel.
Oh dear.
Because she lives across the street from the brothel and would call me when the cops were there or when she saw a new, prostitute dropped off or something like that. So it's been interesting for my my web search history, for my text chains and all of that. I've written a few pieces at the Examiner on the Falls Church whorehouse.
Okay, so the podcast host in me would be drummed out of the union if there was one, if I didn't say at the end of that last bit, and that's why I use ExpressVPN. So I guess this is a novel problem for me of what's the follow-up about brothel coverage has not happened in the 1,000 or so episodes of The Remnant. So this didn't come up with Robbie George. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
So what's the end? Therefore, what? Like, what's the shoe to drop? Like, what's the politics of this? You would think that the Falls Church is it's not super ritzy, but it's
yes.
pretty nice. And
so my neighbors are all liberals who, I mean, I always say 4 years ago or 3.5 years ago, whatever, Glenn Youngkin got elected because all the nice liberals realized that taking their viewpoint to an extreme meant their children weren't learning anything because they were reading Nicole Hannah-Jones and getting transgender ideology instead of learning. And so there's a little bit of rebellion. How much liberalism are these upper middle class suburban liberals allowed to put up with? And everybody whose kids' school bus stop can see the brothel. They've been mugged by reality.
Yeah.
But you go onto the neighborhood listservs and they say, well, you're interfering with women's autonomy and that sort of thing. And so the bottom line is it's illegal to so the misdemeanor charges brought against this place were not having a massage license and keeping a bawdy place, BAWDY. So that word probably doesn't show up in a lot of prosecutions. And when I showed up in the courtroom, the deputy prosecutor, at first watching her, I thought she was the defense attorney. And then I realized that she was for the people of Fairfax County, but she just dropped the bawdy place charge and hit him for the license, which they still actually don't have. And so the bottom line is that you have politically motivated liberal prosecutors in Fairfax County who just refuse to enforce the law. I mean, this guy became a national celebrity, Descano, when he wrote a piece in the New York Times saying, if Virginia outlaws abortion, I'm not going to enforce the law. Well, Virginia has also outlawed prostitution, and he apparently is not going to enforce the law. So I don't think people care that much, but I don't think it's going to get him drummed out. And so, let me be more precise. Unfortunately, I've learned more about the illicit massage parlor business. And it seems that everywhere there are massage parlors where one can obtain sexual favors. Not favors, because you're paying.
Right, not favors.
Sexual products. On sale.
Goods and services.
But a lot of them are A, actual massage parlors where there's like illegal extras, and B, they're like in the back of an office park. And that's just kind of the thing, society's going to live with. Unfortunately, we're fallen people and we're vaguely capitalistic, and that's going to exist. This place, the Falls Church Brothel on Summerfield Road, just sells sex, and it's right next door to a house where there's a woman who has a 10-month-old baby and her husband, and across the street down the road from a school bus stop. So that's sort of why it's getting some extra excitement. It's not that somebody somewhere is selling sex in Falls Church, but that there's a place that just sells sex, obviously illegally, and it's actually in a 2-story colonial right next to a residential home.
So we're gonna move on shortly, but this seems like such low-hanging fruit for Glenn Youngkin to kind of like scratch a little bit of a MAGA itch. Populist guy comes in. Plus,
or the Attorney General, Jason Miyares, is running for re-election in a tough race. It would seem that the Attorney General, the Republican in Virginia, would want to go after the Democrats and say the Dems are trying to legalize prostitution.
Yeah.
They haven't said a word.
Also, Glenn Youngkin's also like, a sweater vest, Christian guy too. There's a lot of different angles where you can come in on this. I was reading one of your pieces about this, and I get that there are people on the sort of libertine left, and obviously the libertarian right, but who are okay with prostitution if the archetype is, Julia Roberts in, Pretty Woman kind of thing, right? But like the reality is that these are often like sex trafficked
Yep.
illegal immigrants who have basically been sold into sexual slavery kind of stuff. Back when this would happen to white women, it was called, that's what the word white slavery used to mean for, for a while. You would, and progressives don't like that. I mean, I don't,
No.
I like the magnet effect of subsidizing that industry, you think would create more of a backlash.
And one way I put it, I know one guy in the neighborhood who has tried to alert ICE to the existence of this house on the assumption that at least one of either the proprietors or the more likely the women who work there is here illegally. So I want to like tell the liberal prosecutor Steve Descano, like, you can show up and shut down this brothel, explain to these women if they're here illegally that they need to go back to China, because the alternative might be like Steve Miller and his group showing up and these women all end up in a prison brig in Malaysia. Like, for a humanitarian thing at this point, wouldn't you want, county state prosecutors showing up, shutting down the people who run it, convicting them of a felony, and making sure that the women are sent back to where they came from in a way a little more gentle than ICE seems to be doing.
All right. We will stay on top of this, so to speak, this story. And but moving on from the body and the profane, I figure we should talk about something wholesome now, which is baby making. There was, as you know, I used to work for Ben Wattenberg, and Ben Wattenberg was one of these guys who was sort of on the Tim Carney beat in the 1970s and 80s with his book The Birth Dearth. And so I've done a lot of TFR, Population Research Center, data crunching in my youth because I was so cool. And then the whole topic kind of went dormant for about...
The girls must have loved that when you were talking to them about birth rate at the bar. That totally. Must have been a winner.
Yeah, especially when you have to explain that the replacement rate is 2.1 and not 2. That goes down all sorts of great sexy conversational rabbit holes. And then it sort of came back for a while and then went dormant again, and now it seems to be heating up again. So like, yes, you're on top of all this stuff. You wrote a great book about it. Where is the fertility debate these days? The natalist debate, I should say.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's certainly changed a lot. So when I was doing the research for Family Unfriendly, and I would, tweet out some of my thoughts, every time I tweeted something about a birth rate, I would get people responding and saying, "You are so creepy. Why do you care about other women or whatever?" And so that to me reflects an individualism that I think has gone too far in this culture that we should talk about. But now, and then when I pitched my book, I talked to my agent, very good guy, definitely a liberal, loves to learn conservative arguments. He's probably about 60 years old. And he said when he got my proposal, he was shocked. He still thought overpopulation was a problem. And so this is 2022. And he said he Googled it and he was just absolutely stunned to learn that the birth rate was well below replacement and falling before COVID, and that it was going down further since. And so now, and actually to their credit, the New York Times has been kind of on top of it since before COVID, and just trying to say, well, this is why we need more liberalism. This is why we need more feminism, more government support, that sort of thing. But most of the world tried to ignore it until after COVID, when there was people said, oh, a lockdown baby boom, right? What else are you going to do? No, there was a total COVID baby bust. We didn't really recover from that. And so now people can't ignore it. So then, as far as the people who are talking about this a lot, they're on the right. There are a lot of conservatives, people like me who for a while didn't think we had to make it clear that we want more babies by married couples. And then from other portions of the right come Elon Musk, who's just saying, if you will have my child, like, DM me and we will arrange this. And then some of the pro-natalists, sort of either in the MAGA or libertarian worlds, which have a weird techie overlap. They're really just for, make the number go up.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that's artificial wombs or IVF or that sort of thing. So people like Brad Wilcox, Lyman Stone is
Mm-hmm.
the best pronatalist Twitter, along with a guy who used to be at my neighborhood pool who tweets under more births, and just doing this like research, because we don't know what can make birth rates go up. It's
Mm-hmm.
really hard to do it. China was very good at making birth rates go down, and then they have a communist government trying to drive the birth rate up, and they've totally failed. The left has started to get into it. There was recently a hilarious tweet about, the conservatives have fooled us into thinking that only right-wingers care about babies, but we need to worry about it too, because it turns out the people most not making babies are liberals, white liberals. So the debate is interesting. And at the March for Life, J.D. Vance said, I want more babies born in the United States. Not just I want fewer abortions. I want more young people getting married and having babies. So you've got kind of various people saying, you know what, it would be better if more people could have babies, ranging from, but at the same time, I think Republicans in office, sort of slightly older ones, boomer ones, are still worried to talk about it because they still think the biggest problem is too many out of wedlock births rather than not enough births overall. And there are still a lot of people on the left, the establishment left, Democratic establishment, who think that they are being overly preachy, that they're trying to control women's bodies if they say, yeah, it would be good to like help people have more babies.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, it doesn't help. The people like Douglas Wilson. Did you see his interview on CNN with?
No.
So, sort of Christian nationalist guy. I actually wrote an introduction to a debate book between him and Christopher Hitchens like 20 years ago.
Wow.
And it's Pete Hegseth's church. This was the controversy because
Okay.
he endorsed something about it, and they don't want their official position is women shouldn't vote. Their official position, and in the interview, Doug Wilson, was a couple of weeks ago, said, "Look, women are people that other people come out of." And fact check, true.
Yeah.
But talking like that, I mean, this is one of the problems. I think the right is really good at seeing the problems that the fringe left gets the center left into, and is less good at seeing the problems that the fringe right gets the right into. And if you're a false church liberal, let's put it that way, right? Someone and you see that on CNN, and then you hear Tim Carney come on, 2 days later talking about how women should have more babies or people should have more babies. There's going to be a really unfair association between your position, which is not that women shouldn't vote, which is not that, that women are breeders and that's it. It's very hard to see how you sort of this was always a problem at National Review, is like, when do you say, okay, these people aren't us, and try to, excommunicate them and all that kind of stuff.
Well,
but on this issue, it's just so radioactive for people.
I think that Elon Musk provides a foil, again, for the pro-family people. And being pro-family is too conservative for a lot of people. I mean, when I say, more people getting married is good, children being raised by married parents, even Melissa Carney, not related to me, spells her name differently, was basically a liberal economist, and she found through her economic research that children do a lot better when they're raised by married parents. In her book, The Two-Parent Privilege, she got her liberal card basically pulled for being too preachy. And it was a minority of liberal commentators who were like, yeah, she kind of has a point there. And so there's a lot of the country for which just I'm too preachy by doing that. But part of what I tried to do in my book was I started with sort of the hectic life of a suburban parent and travel sports and helicoptering and the belief that if you don't helicopter, CPS is going to come and take your baby, to start and say like, yeah, there's a lot of forces at play making raising kids harder in our life, to start with sort of an attempt at empathy and understanding is a big part of what I try to do in my books in general. But in this case, to say like, look, we know why people think that this is unattainable, but it is attainable. Here's a discussion of the policies around it. But to say, hey, you want kids but think it's not in the cards, maybe society should be improved a little bit. That's kind of the approach I try to take to avoid pushing people off. But I also, I mean, to give you an idea of how there's an oversensitivity on the left that it's impossible to breach. I had a friend, he was talking to some former Obama administration people involved in housing, and they were like, we want housing abundance and all sorts of housing, including in the suburbs. And my friend said, yeah, that would be great. And one of the ways you can pitch this as extra importance is that more suburban houses would help people have families. And this Democrat in housing, formerly in the Obama administration, was like, whoa, we don't want to say help people have families. We just want to say help them live the life they hope to live. So there's a vision of the good life that I have, that you have, that I think most Americans have, which is, for most people, it's you grow up, you finish your education, you get a job, you have kids, you coach them in Little League, you have a barbecue where eventually your kids can run around unsupervised and you're drinking beer with the other dads and eating grilled meats, and it's all great. That vision of the good life it grates on some of the overly individualistic strains of the day. Prescribing anything besides just whatever you want to do in your life. But B, marriage and parenthood involve sacrifice for others. They involve giving up autonomy. And so I think there's bigger cultural headwinds from the elites that we're pushing against. At the same time, as you're pointing out, that some of the people who want more babies are either techno weirdos who want them made in artificial wombs, or want to, inseminate whoever, as many people as they can, or they actually are people who, the creeps that the liberals think I am.
Right. And also there's Alan Tate types. What's his name? Not Alan Tate, the horrible MMA.
Yeah. Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
I don't think he's pro-conception. I think his idea of the marital act is not, yes.
But there is this, there is this weird subculture of sort of incel-y, weird
and
young
I'll tell
men.
You, I ran into this once when I was practicing my book talk, and I spoke at a local Knights of Columbus chapter. And all the old guys were like, this is a great talk, this is excellent. And one young guy came up to me and said, I think the problem is education. And I thought he meant that it was too expensive, or that education was drawing people towards profession. And I started to be, yes, our schools, they just say that your adulthood is just about making money and your career is like, no, it's these women graduating with an English degree that's totally useless. And then if I marry her, I have to pay off her student loan. And one of the old guys who was in the audience just like grabbed him and turned him around and was like, if you think you're the mother of your children getting an education is useless, you need an education. And I said, and also man up.
Yeah.
Pay off for student loans.
Right.
And so that is one of the things that we're up against.
All right, so let's go to a higher altitude place for a second. I think we can both agree that the decline in babies is a multi-pronged
many
thing.
causes.
Many
Yes.
causes. Some explain some cases very well and don't explain other cases at all. But that said, big picture, like for the median American or the median advanced democratic OECD country, what are your top 3, 4 reasons for it?
So it's tricky because there are some just serious outliers here, Israel being the main one. But let me if you want something, so affordability, we can't afford it. That's largely overstated. For the most part, you look at different affordability measures, and on a local level, that doesn't predict the birth rate change, right? More student debt held by young adults doesn't predict a greater drop off in the birth rate. All of these other measures. But the cost of owning a home does. And in my opinion, I don't know that every single demographer would agree. Probably, I think they would. But the cost of owning a home for Americans, and again, this is, I think Spaniards are more willing to like own a flat, rent a flat, and raise kids. In the United States, you kind of want to have a house, at least a tiny little patch of grass or something when you have a kid. And that cost, I think, really does deter family formation. The problem with this as an explanation for the whole baby bust is the baby bust started in 2009, and the craziness of owning a home has been a last 5-year thing. But that is
well, and also, I mean, just defense global population has, the population rates, population in the West, including industrial countries, Japan, right? I mean,
yeah,
they've been sub replacement for.
Yes.
I mean, I don't even know how long it's been for Japan, but it's been a long time.
And Japan shows the complexity of this because Tokyo has just been massively expanding its housing stock, but in really tall apartments with like 1 and 2 bedrooms. So that's and this is the next research I want to do, is what sort of housing is pro-family. So that's number one. But I think you got to get actually deeper on this. I think that there's a spiritual, psychological issue here. Why are liberals having so many fewer babies than conservatives? I think they're more neurotic, and I know they're less religious, and they're less hopeful about the future. So if your climate fear, and I spend the last 2 chapters sort of on this, if your climate fear and your economic fear or your racial guilt are so heavy, you're a lot less likely to want to produce more of you for the future. If you have a more supernatural religious outlook and you don't think that the headlines, the stock market, the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere tell you what human happiness and flourishing in the future will be, then you're more likely to sort of take the leap of faith and have kids, which is, again, this act of blind hope in the future in a lot of cases. And so my last chapter is called Civilizational Sadness. I talk about the people who blame climate and say, oh, well, Miley Cyrus, there's not going to be fish in the water. Why would we want to have kids in that world? And Ezra Klein smartly comes in, he's like, come on, if you're in a rich country, you're going to be fine. You're going to adapt. What you're really saying is that you feel guilty. You feel guilty for poisoning the planet for the poor people. I think that it is also a cover story. I think there is a guilt, but I think it's a deeper guilt. I think it's a belief that we are not actually good. Whether we as wealthy Americans, white people, the people of Park Slope, the people of Falls Church, I think it's a lack of a belief in human goodness. And this is one of my explanations for the baby boom, was that this wasn't just a makeup. If you look statistically, it wasn't just a makeup for the babies who weren't born during the war. It was this massive thing where marriage rates moved earlier, birth rates hit highs that they hadn't been at in decades, and went on for a whole generation. Why? Well, because in 1945, our men got off the boat, just having defeated 2 evil empires. Our women, who just kept the economy going, making these awesome, unprecedented weapons in the factories for 4 years, greeted them there. They smooch on the pier. They go back to the chapel. They get married. They have a ton of babies. Why? Well, more than ever before or ever since, we knew that we were good. And Europe didn't really have that post-war baby boom. The people who led the baby bust, as you remember from your studies in the second half of the 20th century, were Japan, Germany, and Italy.
Mm-hmm.
The people who, when asked, are we good, couldn't really say yes. And so that same guilt that hit the Germans in the 1970s, I think, is hitting the Park Slopers today.
All right, so just a little housekeeping. When you say you think they're more neurotic, we should note that's not just your sort of pejorative opinion. There's a lot of data on this that says that people left of center, certain demographics, Park Slope types that we're using as a euphemism, are literally more neurotic. I mean, like lots of lefties have written about this. It's a social science thing. Um, and I will stipulate that I think your explanation is partially true, and I think that helps explain why Israel is an outlier, right?
Yes.
And Israel's an outlier in all sorts of things. I mean, Sebastian Younger makes this point about how Israel, which sees some really ugly fighting, as much as any military in the world sees ugly fighting, has among the lowest rates of PTSD.
Wow.
Because the disconnect between the atomized sort of civil society and the rigors of the military is just not nearly as sharp as it is for some kid who comes back from Fallujah and then goes to the mall in Scottsdale, right? It's just a different mindset. So I think there's a lot to all of that. At the same time, Lyman Stone, I've seen him do these presentations about how hard it is to get fertility up, get the birth rate up. And it's really interesting data. And one of the factoids, one of the data points he points to is just simply that birth rates go down when you have more options for fun in your 20s. I mean, I don't mean to be glib about it, but it's true. Yeah. It's like he actually tracked data about, about the proximity to really cool beach vacations and birth rates. And the more options you had to go to Tahiti, say, the lower the birth rate. And so there is something, and again, he would not for the moment say that that's the only explanation for any of this. He's just saying, it's a multivariate problem. So, before you get to the sadness of civilization thing, isn't there just simply the problem that, when I say problem, it's a challenge, right? Because there are a lot of good things associated with this too. But women are delaying giving birth later because they want careers. They're investing in their education. And so the simple act of delaying giving birth is going to reduce the birth rate, right? If you start giving birth when you're 20 and you start giving birth when you're 30, the number of babies you're going to have is going to be smaller if you start at 30. And so the question is, like, how do you, as a fan of liberal democratic capitalism, what do you say about the charge that it's really capitalism's fault?
Well, so
which is out there, as you know.
Yeah. First of all, one of the important things that every conservative needs to think about when you start laying this out, and I do this in both Alienated America and Family Unfriendly, is to say there were conditions that made certain parts of the good life easier that were themselves not great conditions in the past. And what a conservative has to do is not try to return, with a V in the place of that U, not try to return to 1954, because, well, part of the reason our economy was so good in 1954 is because Europe was in shambles. Set aside the racial, the immigration, the lack of free trade, all that stuff. Like we're not going to go back there. We shouldn't bomb Europe to get the 1954 economy back, but we should ask what from the past can be restored and what sort of either old wisdom or creative new proposals would bring that about. But so the way I put it is the logic of capitalism has crept into our social arrangements, and that is bad. The logic of capitalism for me is appropriate for trade and finance and economics and that sort of thing. That my wages should be determined by negotiation, that what is sold should be determined by this impossibly complex system of suppliers and manufacturers and customers and retailers, and that price is really it. The price system is the best way to get prosperity. But if the logic of capitalism requires a lot of flexibility, you want a little bit lower friction. So I had a guy who used to clean the gutters in my house. This is one of my pro-family things, is after you have kids and after you turn 30, you should avoid getting on your roof and getting on real high ladders. So this is something that you should hire people to do. I love fixing everything I try to avoid. getting on really tall ladders. And so he was good. I liked him. And then his prices kept going up and up and up. And eventually I switched to somebody else who didn't have such high prices. There's no way my conscience would be bugged by switching. This guy's obviously making a ton of money because his prices are going up, right? We shouldn't have that attitude towards the social aspects of our life, where we live, where we go to church, who we're married to, who we're going to feed on a given day. Obviously, there's no normal person who is thinking, okay, I'm going to trade out my kids for someone else. But to some extent, that's a reason to not have kids. The reason to not have to not get married is because you're sacrificing your autonomy. And so what I would say is there's parts of the logic of capitalism which run contrary to the logic of family. That family is kind of irrational, unyielding, permanent thing, and that's part of our problem. And so I don't blame capitalism. What I would say though is that the housing problem I talk about, I don't think just unzoning will get us a ton more family houses. I worry that building a bunch of studio apartments, that the atomized individual, the guy living alone, Matt Iglesias recently had a tweet about like the immigrants we should want are childless, high-earning people in their mid to late 20s. I thought that's what every city in America wants because they have more disposable income and they spend a lot more money. Right. And that's also, to channel Wendell Berry, that's what the marketers want. That's what sort of big business wants. This is what Walmart wants. I mean, maybe not Walmart because they sell a lot of diapers and diaper pails. But, you know, if you just wanted to maximize the GDP in the short term, you wouldn't want families like mine or my neighbors, where our summer activity is kid run around the neighborhood, where my wife cooks dinner for 6 people, which involves a lot less exchanging of goods and services than going out to dinner and going out to the bar every night. And so this is the way in which I would say the critiques of capitalism from the pro-family people do make sense, is that if the market had an appetite, what it would want is us all to be alone and isolated. And so thankfully, the market is a tool. It's something we use to be more prosperous and get the stuff we want. We don't let it tell us how to live.
Yeah, so for listeners who have their remnant bingo cards, what Tim just did was basically give his own version of the Hayek microcosm versus macrocosm, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft thing that I talk about all the time here. Capitalism's freaking awesome for the things it's awesome at. It's not particularly great for the things it's not great at, right? You know, spoons are great for eating soup. They're not great for eating steak, you know, and different tools for different things. So since we keep talking about housing, I'm kind of just curious, what is your state of, I don't know, agreement or ambivalence? You can go on either axis towards the abundance Democrat stuff.
So I think, there's a mixture of agreement and ambivalence. I want abundant families and children. I want abundant housing. To some extent, there's an image on the cover of the book, which is like this big green area and then this massive futuristic city with high rises. That's the opposite of what I want. I want that massive city to sprawl a little bit into the green area, and there should be kids running around the green area between homes. In other words, suburban abundance might be the closest that I'm at. And again, I'm just starting my research on what family-friendly housing is, but I think that half of it is going to be sort of moderately dense suburbs. People like yards, but they don't have to be big. And if there's a trade-off, a shorter commute, enough bedrooms, and a little bit of privacy, so that you have the proper level of sort of domestic home, but that forces you out into the neighborhood. I'm a big it takes a village guy. Like when you were talking about the atomized coming home from war, PTSD, I think a lot of the problems, including in family formation, is that people don't have enough support from neighbors. And I think that suburbs with small yards and enough bedrooms really it could create the optimal setting where kids are feral and run free, where parents can sort of mind their own business when they have to, but it's pretty easy for them to step out of their front door and bump it into their neighbor. So I would want a suburban abundance. Let's, build a few more houses in the more spread out suburbs. Let's build a little more sprawl. If we need policy to make it easier to help the people in the exurbs to work from home 3 days a week, let's do that. So that's the way I would steer them.
And so, part of this is sort of devil's advocacy on the fly. But I'm not going to push back on this a little bit rather than from sort of, well, what the academic literature says. I'm not sure I agree with you. First of all, big picture, what you want, I'm very sympathetic to and all that. And I don't want to just argue from anecdata, but suburbs can be atomizing too. And you like me, originally hail from New York City. And there's a lot of mythology about the role that cities had at the beginning of the 20th century. Yoni Applebaum, I don't know if you read his book, Stuck. I highly recommend it. Much more, no offense to Ezra and what's his face, really liked Applebaum's book. I learned a lot from it. I found it very useful. One of the things I did not really appreciate, it's not the topic for here so much, but the whole big sort thing is just wrong. That we are less mobile than we've ever been. People haven't moved to states to live like with like. It's more that those weird prehistoric islands where because they're cut off from the landmass, the elephants get small kind of thing. Communities that don't have a lot of in-migration and out-migration, they self-homogenize. And he runs you through all that. But the relevant part is, what gets the incredibly bad rap, and I'm sure you had a very similar high school civics or social studies class about this, tenements. Tenements were actually pretty good. Lots of family formation, lots of civil society, lots of community.
Some of my favorite ancestors lived in tenements.
Yeah, although the ancestors in the tenements that yours were in probably got into fights with the ancestors that mine were in, but that's a different story. This Applebaum makes this case that the way to think about tenements on the Lower East Side is not urban squalor and deprivation, but Little House on the Prairie. And that these were economic migrants, came here with families, looking for the American dream. Cities, look, AI may change everything, so let's put that aside for the time being. Cities are the place that create economic opportunity for poor people, create opportunities for family formation for poor people. That's why all those mega cities throughout the third world, poor people from poor villages move to cities for a shot at a dream kind of thing and for economic mobility. And it is not obvious to me that the ideal way, certainly not the sole way, but I don't think you'd be arguing that.
No.
The ideal archetype for civil society, for sticky institutions that people feel like they're part of something, I don't think we should write off the role for cities in that. The problem is that because of the zoning stuff, cities have pushed out the ability to have economic opportunity out to exurbs, right? When we were kids, I always thought it was weird how in France, like in Paris or in London, the quote unquote inner city was the fanciest, most expensive part of the place, while the inner city, in New York and Detroit, whatever, was the worst. And that's because in those cities, they pushed all the poor people out to the outer to the banlieue or whatever you call them, right? And into the housing projects and that kind of stuff. that's what's sort of been happening to a lot of our big cities is we're pushing the ability to have a middle class life in a city or an aspirational lower middle class to be middle class life. The whole idea of becoming middle class now is so entrenched with the suburbs that I think it's bad for poor people and it's bad for cities. And I think that you should have a little more tolerance for the idea that some of the things that you want can be achieved in a city rather than you have to go out to the suburbs with all the driveways and the cars in the driveway kind of life.
No, and you pointing to the cars and the driveways and the attached garage, and there's certainly a story, and I think I tell it in Alienated America, of how suburbs can be alienating, how it's possible to go where, especially with the loss of the downtown of small town America, you drive 3 towns away to a Walmart where most of the people are not from your town. And there's not the serendipitous encounters. And so one of the beautiful things about cities, when people say, I love my neighborhood, a lot of what they mean is that they keep accidentally bumping into friends or meeting really interesting neighbors, the serendipitous encounters.
Or they know there's certain guys are going to be at the coffee shop or the diner or, the cigar shop or whatever it is. And that's what makes it a neighborhood.
Yes. And I similarly, I don't know if I told you, Jonah, I'm a Catholic, and
I've heard rumors. I'm glad we could finally confirm this on the Remnant.
I had, when I lived in Maryland, I had this great Catholic parish, but it was in the middle of the Eruv. There were 2 Orthodox synagogues on either side of it, and so the people who lived walking distance in this neighborhood overwhelmingly went to Young Israel instead of to St. Andrews, right? So very few parishioners of St. Andrews were willing to pay the premium to live in that neighborhood because we were allowed to drive to our Sabbath services. And so as a result, almost nobody who went to church at St. Andrews lived walking distance to St. Andrews. We lived a very short drive. It would be a hiking distance, right? Mm-hmm. And so I just realized that people weren't sort of like accidentally walking by. Parishioners weren't accidentally walking across like the parish lawn and walking down the sidewalks. You had to have a reason to show up there. And that's one of the things that happens typically in all sorts of suburbs is if you have to have a reason to be somewhere, and it's not just passing through, because when you're passing through, you're in a car with the windows up and, your podcast playing and all of that. And so that takes away some of the neighborhoody feel. So absolutely suburbs can have that feel, but at their best, I mean, yesterday I didn't know where half of my children were because it was low crime. There's all sorts of downsides to my neighborhood. We don't have enough sidewalks. There's a brothel, but otherwise, it's low crime. People wander into, and like the 8, 9, 10-year-olds on the cul-de-sac wander into and out of everybody's neighborhood. So we as parents, we don't have to plan anything. Our kids can get places without driving. I don't mind that for me to get to the hardware store, I have to drive. For me to get to the metro, I have to drive. Because what really matters to me is that my kids can get around without my needing to take them around. And so cities do that well, but at their best, suburbs do that well too. And one of the reasons I want to emphasize suburbs is I think a lot of the YIMBYs, people want, yes, in my backyard, a lot of the urbanists, they'll always talk about the importance of a walkable third place. And there was a point once where, again, Lyman Stone was reacting. There's an overhead shot of a neighborhood in Phoenix. And somebody said, how could anyone live in this hell? And the house, the shot was about 80 houses, fairly densely packed, single-family homes. Half of them had swimming pools. There were sidewalks. There were a couple little pocket parks here. And Lyman was like, who wouldn't want to live in that walkable neighborhood where like a dozen of your friends live nearby? And one response was, walkable to what? There's not a single bookstore, coffee shop, or cocktail bar in that shop. And I realized that for my kids, what a third place is different, even than for me. But there's this one street corner where there's a large overgrown bush, but because there's a fire hydrant right there, the county always comes and carves it out. So it's like a cave. It's just called the Big Bush. And that's a third place. If you're an 8-year-old, you go and you hang out in the shade of that. Yeah. Like somebody's front porch can be a third place. And so that's part of why I want to emphasize the suburbs is that sometimes just being a family around other families, that's what people need. You need more than a coffee shop. You need friends, right? The coffee shop is an excuse to make friends. The cocktail bar is an excuse to make friends. Just like the events at the parish are an excuse to get together. And so the suburbs can provide other sorts of excuses to get together that the cities don't. And I would say that it's gotten better in the last few years, but certainly after and during COVID, there were massive crime waves in a lot of our cities. And it just, if that's going to happen again, if it's going to smell like pot, I don't know that I want, my kids walking around there. I grew up in Greenwich Village, and it was like a rare combination of
Never
lot of
smells
crack
like pot down there.
Well, it didn't at the time because it was crack dealers.
Yeah.
But it was like if you weren't doing the crack, you were pretty well off. For some reason, there wasn't a lot of gun violence. So like high crack, low crime, I'll take that too for my kids. So I'm not against the cities, but I think that what most Americans who want to be parents, what they want a house. The yard doesn't have to be big, but the 2-year-old can run around because it's fenced in. And then the 8-year-old can wander the neighborhood totally unsupervised.
Yeah, no, I get that. The only place I'd really push back is that in order to get people to have more kids, having kids has to be conducive with the lifestyle that people want.
That they want, yes.
And there are certain people I know, I've known them, I'm sure you've known them, I'm sure you've heard from them, who like the idea of having kids, but they don't want to move out of the city, right? They want to be city people, but it's too expensive to have kids, and they think it's contrary to the life that they have picked out for themselves. And, this is sort of my complaint with how, like, I don't like a lot of the National Guard stuff. I think a lot of it's pretextual, and we can talk about that. But the response from some liberal Democrats to sort of poo-poo the idea that crime is a problem or that you should get upset about crime. I keep thinking about...
If you can't deal with a guy ODing on your subway ride, then you shouldn't live in the city.
Or someone taking a dump in the sandbox at your kid's playground, or...
Yeah.
I remember Seth Rogen, I don't know why, it just sticks with me. I like Seth Rogen, but I remember him on Twitter a couple of years ago saying, look, I spent a lot of time living in San Francisco. My car was broken into all the time. What's the big deal? Who cares? Right? And it's like, well, if you have a lot of money, it's like you think it's part of the glamour of being in the city. But if urban liberalism, if urban progressivism isn't about running big cities and proving that that's and doing it well, then what is it for? Right? And so the response to the idea that crime is a problem by sort of belittling it is a really arrogant kind of noblesse oblige thing. And in part because crime is a regressive tax on poor people. But I think a lot of the things that you like about family and civil society are achievable in cities because they existed in cities before. Yes. And they exist in many cities to this day. Like Pittsburgh, I think, has a lot of what you're talking about, and it's a city. But what it requires is something close to a zero tolerance for crime kind of thing. When you start talking about crime as if it's a lifestyle or it's an alternative way of living, the externalities of it drive away people who want to start businesses, want to start families, and the zoning stuff and all of these things, they make it more difficult for cities to be livable, except for the alienated, atomized people that you're talking about. You're free to respond to that, but we should also, in the very limited time we have left, for years you were like one of my go-to guys on crony capitalism being bad in your telling.
Yes.
I'm sure you might remember, you're a little younger than me. There used to be this commercial, it ran on Channel 5 all the time, about it was a little kid with his grandpa in a boat. They were fishing, and the kid says something about his friend Timmy or something like that. And his grandpa says, well, who's Timmy? And he says, he's my Jewish friend. And grandpa explains, well, if he was your friend, you would just say he's your friend. You wouldn't care that he's Jewish. And it was like this little more you know kind of public service thing about anti-Semitism or whatever, which I always thought was really weird. But I would often describe you as my anti-import export bank
Export
friend.
import bank.
Export import bank.
I thought you were going to say mackerel snapper friend, but yeah,
No. I have too many of those. I was at National Review for 20 years. I think you. Let me just phrase it this way. I would love to find out that you dispute this, but I can't imagine that you do. That if you saw this level of crony capitalism from a Democratic administration, the freak out on the right would be much greater than it is right now. How do you navigate this?
I think that, so when I would write a column about Obama doing something that was clearly, I'm going to make government power bigger, and this is going to help the well-connected and hurt the economy, there were more conservative institutions and Republican members of Congress who sided with me. Now I write that about Trump. I mean, I said, look, he attacks companies, and then those companies hire his friends as lobbyists. Like, literally, the lobbying firm where his chief of staff and attorney general used to work basically picks up a client when Trump either threatens them with a tariff or just ad hoc, ad hominem, threatens them. And that he has sort of a custom-made approach to governance that's good for the lobbying industry. Think about tariffs. Tariffs, Congress handed, and to a disputed extent, Congress seems to have handed the president the power to impose, has handed the president the power to impose tariffs in emergencies or for national security. And it's very easy for the president to turn off and turn on tariffs and to pick and choose who gets them. That's much better if you're trying to bring wealth into the swamp than a law passed by Congress that applies uniformly to everyone, right? You want there to be a ton of executive decision-making power, and you want to have both the carrot and the stick. We will tax you, we will protect you, we will subsidize you, we will attack you, we will tweet that everybody will buy your stuff. And so Trump's approach, with no underlying principle, but so personality-driven, so mercurial, is in some ways, ideally, not for the lobbyists to get the laws they want, because Congress doesn't really do that anymore, but for the lobbyists to go to the clients and say, by the way, what you need is friend who's in Trump's corner. And so this going on was exactly the sort of thing I critiqued under Obama. And again, the Republicans, they could agree with me easily because, I was saying freer markets reduce this corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And now Republicans, members of Congress are, the one unforgivable sin. They're for free markets, but they're more for being on Donald Trump's good side.
Phil Magnus has this great paper kind of explaining how we got the income tax, and part of it is precisely because of the corruption the tariffs created, that Congress is like, the only way we can, let this cup pass from my lips, because tariffs invite special pleading.
Necessarily, yeah.
By definition, they do, right? And so, and it's not necessarily you want a favorable tariff for yourself. You just may want a punitive tariff for your competition.
The Tea Party literally wasn't about a tariff; it was about an exception to a tariff.
Right.
Like, that was the original sin. That was the tipping point. That was the one thing the Brits did. And so all sorts of exceptions. And again, by necessity, it makes some sense to say, we're going to accept the aluminum if you're using it to make a washing machine here. It's like, okay, if you have that idea of we're going to prop up, we're going to do industrial policy, you're going to start making exceptions. But once that door gets open, it's going to be all sorts of special pleading. Everybody's going to say, and I use the example, the Snuggie. Is it a garment or is it a blanket? Now, I forget which one was tariffed more than the other, but the Snuggie goes ahead and just spends millions, the company, trying to say, no, this thing we're importing from China, it's the one that's tariffed less.
Right.
And So it's a very fertile ground for cronyism, the tariff economy.
My favorite example of that was about 15 years ago now. Again, I can't remember which way the tariffs went, but there was a different rate for stuffed toys, dolls that weren't like action figures, right? So like G.I. Joes and Barbies were taxed at a different rate than teddy bears. And this company lobbied super hard to argue that X-Men action figures
because they're mutants.
Because they're mutants, are not human beings, and they're sure to be taxed at the tariffed at the other rate, right? Those sorts of distortions are everywhere once you get into this game, right?
But that's like, not a hard question. They're obviously humans. Like, come on, have they not read a single?
I know.
Oh my gosh,
I'm Homo superior
up here, Jonah.
But so we could do the market distorting stuff all day. We could do the hypocrisy of people who claim to be free market all day. Putting on your pundit hat, how long lasting do you think this is? Do you think the Republican Party has fundamentally transformed beyond, look, either for constitutional or actuarial reasons, Trump won't be here forever. And is the Republican Party now just simply a protectionist party going forward? And if not, how does that, what does a snapback look like?
Well, so one of the things is that I used to, the saying, you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. During 2012, somebody said, it's kind of weird that Mitt Romney is attacking China for cheating. He's trying to hit some protectionist notes. I said, politicians have long campaigned in nationalism and governed in internationalism. George W. Bush was against nation building during the campaign, right? So immigration, foreign wars, and trade are three issues where the elites of both parties were very internationalist for my entire time here until Trump came along. While the base of both parties, and maybe the general public, was a lot more nationalist. Mm-hmm. America, don't mess with us. We are the good guys, but we're not the world's policemen. I think that's what most people believe. That's the median voter. Our trade policy should serve our economy, and our immigration policy is not to be open to the world, but immigrants are good, but we should control who comes in and out. These are very vaguely stated ideas because I'm trying to state like the mm-hmm. view of the median average voter. And so the elites in both parties weren't, maybe everybody since Reagan, weren't willing to say, actually, no, here's why I'm for free trade. And they weren't willing to say, here's why I'm for this number of immigrants. And actually being a little lax on the illegals is probably better. And so the reason they weren't willing to say that is that even Mitt Romney knew that get tough on our economic rivals was what the people wanted. And Trump was the first person to actually deliver that. And so that's why it will be hard to reverse it. And part of what you've been seeing, especially in the last 5 years, has been an attempt to build a more intellectually coherent version of Trumpism, economic populism. This is what I imagine is going on in J.D. Vance's vice president. I mean, he gets domestic policy staff, right? You don't get to make domestic policy as the vice president, but you do get to make a little think tank that builds towards the 2028 campaign. And so I think J.D. Vance is going to try to advance a sort of economic patriotism agenda that makes a little more sense than Trump. I think that the Heritage Foundation and some of the smaller, newer think tanks are going to try to lay that out. And to some extent, they have the public on their side more than the neoliberal shills. And so what
would you use with love, that term?
With love, yes.
Right. The way I use mackerel snapper. It's with
exactly.
love. Yes.
So what will end up happening is hard to read. In part, I think the problem of the economic nationalists is that while they can have some valid critiques of what neoliberalism has done to the working class guy, they don't have good proposals. I mean, Trump's tariffs all over the place will make it harder for JD Vance to say, like, no, I'm going to do tariffs, but I'm going to do it different. And they're going to be the kind of tariffs that are going to make jobs come back to Middletown, Ohio. I don't know that that will be convincing, especially after 4 years of tariffs. I believe, won't seem to have delivered any economic goods to the average American.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, right? Example is the school of mankind, and he will learn and no other, as Edmund Burke says. Like, so much of this, the future of the Republican Party is protectionist stuff, rests on the premise that protectionism works. And it certainly works. I mean, I think you would agree, you've argued this many times. It works for the people who are getting protection to a certain extent, right? Like, it's working out great for Intel right now. But, I mentioned this a while ago on here. Russ Roberts from Econ Talk, he was regaling how in one of the first, like in the late 80s or mid 80s, he was talking to Milton Friedman. And he was saying to Friedman, something, I mean, I'm utterly butchering it, but this is the gist. You must take some satisfaction in the fact that, we want, you led this movement of economists who won all of these arguments and convinced Americans that, wages and price controls and all these things are bad and blah, 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 blah. And Friedman says, no, we didn't do anything like that. What convinced the American people that wages and price controls were bad was wages and price controls. And, the 1970s were terrible. Inflation was terrible. And people said, and so they said, let's look for somebody who offers a different way. And it so happened that the Reaganites had a plan on the shelf that was a different way that happened to be more correct. I don't think this stuff, I mean, it's very difficult not to despair sometimes, but like, if you actually believe in what you believe, you should have some confidence that what you believe is true and you'll be proven right. And if all this stuff is a bad idea, we will see proof of that in due course. And then the trick is for places like AI to be ready to say, okay, you had your shot. This crap doesn't work. Maybe let's go back to the stuff that did work.
Well, and one of the problems that I think our allies in favor of free trade and liberalized economies face is that I think that for Uniontown, Pennsylvania, which is one of the places I visit a lot and featured in Alienated America, the second half of the last century and the beginning of this one was worse than might have been predicted. Like, okay, you'll lose your steel mills, but the workers will shift into slightly lower wage service sector jobs that will be funded by the consumer surplus from everybody else who gets cheaper goods. That's a macro true story, but because, as one economist put it, mobility responses to economic shocks are not perfect. In other words, some people want to stay in Uniontown, but now their son is dying of a drug overdose and their public school bus stop has hypodermic needles outside of it. This is not a slightly lower equilibrium status that they've arrived at. And if the Democrats say, okay, but we'll just give you more welfare, and some of the free market people say, well, get out of Uniontown, neither of those sells well. People who lose their job and are told you'll be fine because we're going to give you welfare, or you'll be fine, you just have to leave this town that your parents and grandparents grew up in, they're not going to be happy with it. And so I've been at multiple meetings in the last 5 years where sort of the small L liberals, the classical liberals, have said, what can we do about rising illiberalism on the right? And I always say, start by acknowledging that a lot of the things they're worried about are things to worry about. If their hometown is crumbling, and then on the cultural stuff, if their public schools system is actually pushing transgenderism on their kids, and the state government is passing a law saying the parents can't tell it, yada, yada. If the school libraries are removing classics and replacing them with, pornographic, graphic novel. If all of that stuff, a lot of that is happening. You may not like the response, even the Ron DeSantis response. You may not like the JD Vance proposed response, but you have to acknowledge the actual suffering. And that's something that I think sometimes, if you're an economist, you just think, as a whole, we're richer. And those people who thought they'd get the job, their dad's job, well, they're just kind of stupid. That's what the free market people need to do, is at least feel the pain.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I don't know, I don't have that much ideas of what constructive responses would be. But to realize that, and David Autor did a lot of these studies, that in localized cases, China entering the WTO really was just bad. And then to add a complexity here, because we're getting late enough that you're not going to make me propose a response, the whole China free trade story, my old late boss, rest in peace, Bob Novak, believed in, was that China was going to liberalize with all this trade. It kind of didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that the free trade people, that's a place where they kind of swung and missed.
Yeah. There's a lot we could engage on that. All I'll say about the China was supposed to liberalize, you're absolutely right that it hasn't. I would just put an M dash with the word yet at the end of that sentence.
Wow, that's very hopeful.
Well, I mean, look, a lot can get worse before it gets better. I think China's got some huge economic problems. I think China's sort of similar to Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. It wants its place in the sun kind of thing, and has a lot of nationalism stuff that's going to make it go south. But the Chinese Communist Party, lots of people have told me this who study this stuff. The Chinese Communist Party is almost as afraid of the people as the people are of it. And
That would be great.
I don't think that's sustainable over the long. I'm more Whiggish than a lot of people are about all this kind of stuff. But that said, I agree with you. Like, if we knew the result of the WTO China stuff, if we had a crystal ball and could have seen this is how it was going to go, then it was a mistake. I agree with that. I disagree with the China shock stuff to a certain extent. The amount of churn in our economy in terms of jobs and stuff is so much greater than the job losses attributed to the China stuff that I'm not saying that China didn't have an effect, but I think robots did more than immigrants or China did.
I mean, I'll say this. Robots are the reason why you're not going to bring those jobs back. And
Right.
That would be my first question for JD Vance. It's like, if you protect our economy, aren't you just making jobs for robots?
Right.
And as far as I know, those robots are made by Siemens in Germany.
Right. Yeah. And you know what else is from Germany? Anyway. All right. Tim Carney, thanks so much for doing this. We could go on a whole bunch of other directions. Always great to have you. And I hope you come back.
Thanks, Jonah.